Well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Shawn Conley. I'm the state soybean and small grain specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. For those of you that are unfamiliar with my speaking style or anything about me, I run a very open, informal program, so feel free to ask me any questions as you will. I'd rather have this be an open discussion than a lecture. We've all been lectured by Emerson for 45 years, so I have a little different speaking style. And he's not even here to enjoy my Emerson jokes. I have about 5 of them in queue, so I do enjoy Emerson. He's one of my favorites. It's going to be. I heard he's retiring in December, so it's going to be sad to see him go. But regardless of that, feel free to ask me any questions as we go through. I would be remiss if I did not thank the major funding agency of my program, which would be the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. I know you have a very strong marketing board and promotion board here in the state of Ohio that supports Ohio State University. And without the checkoff dollars the farmers, put forward, and we have great research boards in both states that help support the researchers on campus. And without them, we wouldn't be able to bring forward this unbiased research that we have. So with that, I'm going to kind of get things started here. And as you well know, I don't like to stand behind. I'm not a podium sitter. It kind of just annoys me. So what I always like to do is when I first start talking is I like to look at the rearview mirror for a couple minutes before I look forward. The reason for this is to kind of get an idea and learn some lessons from, for this case, our 2016 growing season going into 2017. And probably very similar to what Ohio saw, what Illinois saw in most states. This was a record year for Wisconsin. We saw an average state yield of 55 bushels per acre. That was 10% greater than our previous record. Think about that, 10%. That is pretty crazy, all right? And generally what drove that this last growing season was the end of season seed size. In general, we saw 10 to 15% larger seed size going in. If I look forward into implications for that, and I don't know how it was in Ohio, Laura can address this and when she's wrapping things up and correcting everything that me and Emerson and Castile and the rest of us from out of state say. One of the challenges we see, and when I talk to the seed industry in Wisconsin, some of these 40 bushel totes are only going to have 30 bushels in them. I don't know if you're going to see the same thing depending on varieties here. So we're going to have some logistics in terms of totes and seed size. And on the other side, regarding planters, just make sure you know before May 1 if that seed size is larger than normal, if you can get it through your planter. Because I know we've run into challenges a few years ago when we had this seed size issue and when guys have plates and the seed size, they couldn't physically get the seed through the planter because it was so large. So again, I'm not trying to scare anybody here. Just be aware that seed size on average is larger. Know your planting equipment so you can fix that stuff in March and April and not in May when you should be out planting your soybeans. So again, I want to go back and revisit our last growing season. And again, here's a beautiful state of Wisconsin, Cheeselandia, which I like to call it. And I've been back in Wisconsin for roughly, this is going to be my 10th growing season. And I've had individual plots pop at 100 bushels per acre, but never varieties. At our Platteville site, which is right down here, they wish they were part of Iowa. Sometimes they claim to be part of Iowa. We basically had 10 varieties average 100 bushels or more. Okay, this is a no-till, early plant site that we work on farm with the farmers. So we had 10 varieties go 100 bushels or more, which was pretty incredible to us. And if we look at the bigger picture, I'm looking at the state of Wisconsin, the plots, and I'm guessing our genetic yield potential in the state of Wisconsin is roughly between 110 and 120 bushels per acre. So let's use 110 because it's easy math and for me as an agronomist. Okay, so it's 110 bushels per acre, and their state average was what again? Did you all remember what I said? 55. So what's that difference? 55. So that is this yield gap. Well, I'm going to get into that a little bit. I know Laura Lindsay is running this with farmers here in the state, trying to determine what that yield gap is. I'll dig into that a little bit further. But just keep that in the back of your mind because these are some of the things we're going to be discussing in terms of what inputs, what things can you do as a farmer, as a crop consultant to help and minimize that yield gap. And I think the first thing we have to, again, address is genetic yield potential. Because one of the challenges that I look forward, again, into 2017, our farmers are going to want to do what with all of their inputs? They're going to increase them, or are they going to do what with them? They're going to cut them. They're going to cut them. The first thing they're going to cut is seed. Okay? Seeding rates, I'm fine with. We'll talk about our seeding rate recommendations. How low can you go? But the other one I'm actually concerned with is this idea about cutting genetics. And by that, looking to plant inferior genetics because you get it for $5, $7, $8, $10 a bag cheaper. That is not a good program going into 2017. And why is that? We roughly see, whatever region we are in the state of Wisconsin, a 20 bushel swing from the highest yielding variety to the lowest yielding variety. Okay? What's 20 bushels? And let's just use $8 because I'm super conservative, if anyone knows me. Okay? Super. So what's 8 times 20? $160. And then what are you guys grouching about over bag prices? $5 a unit? Don't do it. It's not worth it. Invest in those genetics because that is where drives the yield. If you look at the yield gain over the last 50 years, it's 50% genetics and 50% agronomy. Those breeders like to claim that they take all the credit, but that's not true. It's 50% agronomy, 50% genetics. But again, if you start out with genetics that's a dog, what are you going to harvest? I say puppies, but a dog. Okay? Very similar type of a response. So just think about that as we go through. Now, one of the things coming in, and don't shoot the messenger, and maybe that what I'm about to say might make a few people grouchy at me, but that's all right because I'm leaving the state shortly after I'm done talking, and Laura can clean up the mess. One of the challenges we going forward is in our variety trials, we have new traits coming in the marketplace all the time, new genetics, new traits. And one of the things that are getting pushed, should be pushed, is this question on extend soybeans. So I want to briefly touch on what we see in the state of Wisconsin. All right? So we roughly planted 247 total varieties last year across our entire variety trial region. 200 of them are Roundup Ready to yield. I pulled out all the Roundup Ready ones to kind of give it more of a fair comparison. We have 47 of the varieties across the state where Roundup Ready will basically extend soybeans. And on average, across all varieties, we saw a 2 bushel yield difference between the extend beans and the Roundup Ready beans. All right? Now again, I'm not saying that there's a yield lag or a yield drag there. The point I want to make with this slide is make sure 2 things. Every variety stands on its own, and just because it's the newest and greatest technology that comes to the marketplace doesn't mean it's always the what? Best. We see it in corn when new traits come in the marketplace. We see it in everything that comes in the marketplace. So just don't hop on it just because it's the newest and greatest. There are extend varieties that yield, they're superior yielding, that do great. So what does that tell you as a farmer you should do when you make your decisions? Do your homework. Research. Exactly. Every variety needs to stand on its own, and just because it has a new platform on it doesn't automatically it's going to be the newest and greatest. Does that make sense? Is that fair to everybody? Okay. Excellent. I'll look forward to the hate mail when I get home. All right. Next. Now, this is one of the things that we've been getting a lot of questions on. In the state of Wisconsin, I'm assuming in Ohio we'll see something similar, is we're going to see a record number of soybean acres planted in 2017. Why? Because if you run any type of software program, soybeans are the only crop that's in the black. Okay? Only by $1. Everything else is in the red. Okay? And a lot of the questions we got coming forward are, I'm going to put beans on beans. What are the recommendations for it? And many of you that know me can kind of know that how I think of things. So what do you think my number 1 recommendation of planting beans on beans is? Don't do it. Exactly. All right, that's a little tongue-in-cheek. I understand. I understand economics are driving this. So if you're going to do it, I want to give you some recommendations to consider on how to do this. All right? So number 1, it's very critical that you balance that short-term versus long-term profitability. In the state of Wisconsin, we roughly see 25 to 30% of farmers are going to have a tough time getting an operating loan. Okay? I'm assuming the same thing is going to happen in the state of Ohio. And if you are going to get an operating room loan, who is making the decisions, the farmer or the banker? Okay? So it's amazing. We have these low commodity meetings across the state of Wisconsin. Half the audience in all of these extension meetings across Wisconsin are, guess what? Bankers. They want to know what they should be doing to help growers make decisions. All right? So the point I want to make here is make sure we balance that short-term versus long-term profitability. And here is an example of some data from our long-term rotation system. The point I want to focus in on is right here. Basically, by the time we get to second-year beans, and specifically third-year beans on beans, you basically have the same yield potential as 30 years of continuous soybeans. That's how quickly your yield penalties drop off, mainly because of the disease incidents out there. So if you're going to run second-year beans and you're running that through your spreadsheet, you got to put in a 10% yield penalty. It's what you're going to get. 30 years of data across this is what you're going to get. You're going to get a 10% yield penalty, and figure out how that makes it pay. Because I'll give you some recommendations to help minimize that, but that's straight out what you're going to get is that, on average, is that 10% yield penalty. And be aware that soybean after soybean will alter the pest complex in your fields. So are there any reporters in here? If there are, do not write what I'm about to say. Okay? Are we clear with that? Thank you. So, how many of you farmers rent land for your operations? Right? How many of you farmers rent other farmers' land to rent on? Okay? Now, if you rent land, where do you put second and third year beans? On which land? The land you own or the land you rent? The land you rent. Because if it's a train wreck, you can give it up and you don't have to worry about it. Okay? If you are a landowner, what do you make sure those farmers don't do that rent your land? Cause a problem for that rented land. Okay? Are we clear with that? I'm not advocating it. I'm just looking big term, profitability, 1 year on year. Are we clear? All right. You can begin typing again. Thank you. All right. Number 4, plant a different variety. And by that, I mean don't plant your favorite variety on all your acres again. Because most varieties soybean farmers are planting are what the breeders, companies like to classify as racehorse or whatever, high yielding. I hate that term. Basically, that means there's no disease tolerance in it. That's what that means. Plant a different variety and make sure you have one that has a good disease tolerance and resistance. Specifically for your state, I would say it'd be Phytophthora. Is that the big one here? Maybe there's no true white mold resistance, maybe some SDS. But understand, because last year you built this up and you're going to be planting into that. Now, one of the things I know growers are strictly aware of is the fact that, that there's a lot of same genetics branded under different names. So do your homework. Look at what companies traditionally don't like each other and don't share genetics to make sure that you don't get that same variety. Because you don't want to switch varieties and unbeknownst to you as a farmer, plant the same variety just branded underneath a different name in that same field next year. I am working on a resource through our Soybean Association to help farmers alleviate that. I'm not going to say more than that at this point, but just know that the Soybean Association Wisconsin is looking at research to build a database to allow growers to share that information out there by base of seed tags. All right? Next. Test for SCN and select SCN-resistant varieties. It's a no-brainer. I don't know what percentage of the fields in the state of Ohio that have SCN. I'm assuming it's probably over half. 80%. How many of you farmers knew it was 80%? One guy. He listened to you. Okay, excellent. Next. More hands on deck. Scout, scout, scout. And what do I mean by that? I don't know. This guy, he's a blogger, one of these ag bloggers in the South. I understand because I write a blog and I understand you're always trying to come up with new material and things to get readership. But one of his recommendations was, whatever you do, because if input prices are down, fire your crop consultant in 2017. That was his recommendation. Okay? He must be working for Trump with that type of recommendation. Oh, come on. I know where I am. I know. My whole family voted for Trump. I voted for Bernie Sanders, so that's where you know where I stand at. It's okay. I did not vote for Hillary. I'll just tell you that. I voted for Bernie. I could feel the burn, and I'm feeling it right now. Okay. Well, that's a different story. Actually, that reminds me of a joke. So that's not really a joke, a true story. It's a true story that happened to me. About 10 days ago, I did an extension meeting like this. It was a Sunday. which I really love doing these things on Sunday nights, you know, spending more time away from my wife and kids. So I got done giving a talk from like 5 to 6, and they usually give you like a 5-minute break to use the restroom. So I run in, use the restroom, and you know, these farmers are trying to catch me and ask me questions. And the farmer who was just in my session comes into the urinal right next to me and says, "Hey, Shawn, I got to show you something." That is a true story. I kind of looked at him. I said, "Well, I'm not that kind of a doctor." And then he figured out, you know, in his mind what he had said, and all the other farmers in the bathroom start chuckling. But I just had to tell that story because I can't believe it. I don't even have to make stories up, you know. These are good ones. All right. So I know they're videotaping me or audio taping me, so that'll be good when that's in there, that nice little tidbit. All right. Now, I also understand if you're looking at another, back to reality, sorry about flipping gears on you like that. So I understand that white mold maybe isn't a huge problem, but one of the things we're recommending to growers is make sure that if you do have had a history of white mold, specifically last year, and you're going into that field, cut your seeding rates even lower. By even lower, drop under 140,000 seeds per acre, and don't till that ground. Because tillage, no-till actually makes those sclerotia out in the environment and helps degrade them. All right, so don't till it and drop the seeding rate. It's even lower to help minimize that. Next, use a seed treatment at the max AI fungicide rate. This is one of the inputs growers are going to want to cut. They want to cut their seed treatments. You all repeat with me. Do not cut seed treatments in 17. Come on, do not cut seed treatments in 17. Because you know what? I'm looking around, you are the reason we have to pay so much for seed treatments in Wisconsin. Okay? Because of your issues with Phytophthora and jacking up, I think it's the apron max rate, is because of you all. So thank you, the growers of Wisconsin, thank you for that base rate being as high as it is. So, okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm a giver, and I like to say thank you whenever I can. All right. Number 9. I know Mark Laux is speaking, and I'm not going to get too much into herbicides because he knows a heck of a lot more than I do. But, again, it is critical, folks, specifically in these going into second-year beans, you've got to put that pre out there. You have to. Because those beans are going to grow slower, and you're cutting seeding rates. You got to get that pre out there because water hemp will eat you up. It's going to eat you up anyhow. But if you don't have that pre out there, especially in second-year beans, it's going to eat you alive. And lastly, soil sample and replace K if needed. I'll get into that a little bit further. All right. So one of the tools, where's my phone at? One of the tools we developed at Wisconsin it's called the BeamCam. Okay, this is an app. BeamCam. It is a free app you can download on either the iPhone or Apple or Android platform. Make sure when you type it in, if you go to look for it, you have BEAN underscore or space CAM. Because if you don't, your wife will ask you, what kind of app are you trying to download? There's something that if you don't have a space in there, it's a little weird. Okay, I'm not going to say anything more than that. Okay. So, download this and take a look at it. Basically what it allows you to do is go out and do stand counts. You download it, you can go through, and you have to do a little bit of calibration because every phone camera is a little bit different. But in short, what you see on your phone is this. You pick the row spacing your beans are on, what grow space your beans are on. You line the rows up on your phone with the rows out there in the canopy. You take pictures. This is what you see. That's what your camera sees. What don't you see between these rows? Weeds, because there shouldn't be any out there, right? Exactly. If you have weeds out there, this app is not going to work. So go ahead, snap a bunch of pictures. Here is one of my graduate students. Her name is Marion Lund. She's out doing some calibrations. We have this set up to take 5 random pictures across the field. What you can do then is it gives you the estimated population of 80,327 plants. Okay, that's what your stand is out there. This is your percent maximum yield. You all read that for me. What's it say? 97%. All right? For years, I've been talking to growers about if all you need is 100,000 plants and 70% of soils to maximize yield. between 50,000 plants and 100,000 plants, don't touch it. Leave it alone. No one believes me. All right? I put it into an app, and guess what? Everyone believes me now. Simply amazing. Just because it's in a phone. All right? Now, some people still say, Conley, you are nuts. I live in Ohio. Water hemp's going to eat me alive. I want to go out there and I want to fill in some of these thin spots. I say, fine. Go ahead and do that. Here's our recommended replant rate. About roughly 60,000 plants per acre. And what percent yield gain do you get from that? 1%. Even if you sucker the seed company into giving you free seed for these replants, is it worth your time for 1%? No. Where should you invest your dollars if you want to manage weeds? Herbicides. Put an in-season residual herbicide out there. Don't mess around with the seeds. There's a fallacy that population has a relationship with herbicide resistance. That is not correct. Okay? Just because you have more plants out there does not decrease your selection pressure. Why? Because they're going to germinate and they're still exposed. That is an incorrect statement. Myself and Vince Davis, before he was lured away to industry for more money, decided to go and we did that research together. All right, I'll forward you the paper if you don't believe me. But again, that's what we're looking at with this. So feel free to try this app. We've had some good responses, and I think you can speak with Laura if these recommendations will be somewhat similar here in Ohio. All right, so how many of you have ever had Agronomy 101 or taken an agronomy map? Basically an agronomy class. Anybody? Everybody, most of you here. All right. So you all remember those fantastic old maturity group maps, right? Basically, they drew it here and it went how across this country? Straight line. Okay. I'll give you a hint. That is what they call an expert map. Okay. So here's how an expert map, an expert system is designed. It'd be like last night, me and Emerson Knopfsinger sitting around drinking about 6 beers, okay? At the end of the night, coming up and agreeing on a map, and the next day, that is an expert map. Okay, they're just like most Trump statements, there are 2 things wrong with that comment I just made. What are they? 1, Emerson doesn't drink beer, okay? And number 2, he's an expert at 1, and he wouldn't take my opinion anyhow. So, that was funny. Come on. That, you must not know Emerson at all. Because that, I thought that was funny. But my wife and my kids always tell me, Dad, your jokes stink. So I'm used to it. So anyhow, this is a new maturity group map we just released. Basically, we took all the variety trial data from across the country and put it into this map right here. So we took Laura's data and her predecessor's data across this country. And this was just accepted by Agronomy Journal yesterday as a published paper. Thank goodness we've been fighting. So if you look here in Ohio, right there, on that line, that would be the optimal maturity group for maximum yield would be a 3.5. Okay? Again, there's a lot of caveats in there. That first of all, you see those colors in the bottom left-hand corner? These are standard errors. So there's some error variability across that. So I'm not saying that's what you need to plant, but it gives you some idea of resources in terms of what you should be looking at for maturity groups. And I would agree with what Emerson said earlier, that, we tend, at least in Wisconsin, plant a little bit later maturity group soybeans. What we tend to do is on average yield more, but we see a full maturity group swing in terms of what is a maximum yield. By that, say you're right on that line, it's a 3.5. We'll see some varieties in our trial from a 2.5 to a 3.5 are starred, which means they yield the same. So there's a big swing among those. And a lot of that has to do with the inherent variability between seed companies and how they actually number them. Because Pioneer's 3.5 is going to be different than Asgro's 3.5, which is going to be different than Beck's 3.5, if you know what I mean. So there's going to be some variability between companies. All right, so just take a look at that. Download this if you have any interest on that. So I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about this project that Laura and I and Shawn Castile is here and Emerson and many of us are working on. You see the states that are active. Laura, you're not going to speak to this, are you?
I'm not, but I have surveys, so if anyone wants to survey with a stamped envelope, see me during the break.
Excellent. So this is basically the project that myself and many of us are working on, and I want to sell to you why it's important for you to contribute data. All right, this is kind of, and what kind of data we're going to pull out of this. So this is basically, and you see Ohio is pretty lit up on red. Okay, you don't see any blue on there at all, which is pretty indicative of the last election. And we see here that the number of fields we have, at least to this point, is roughly 3,600 fields. So we've got 3,600 fields and over 300,000 acres of yield data. Okay, think about that. This is agronomic data, yield data, weather data from over 300,000 acres across the country and 3,600 fields. By the time we're going to get done with this, our target is to hit 1 million acres of soybeans, okay, and 9,000 farm fields. How many of you have ever heard about the term big data? Okay, maybe you read about big data. How many of you have ever seen a big data talk where they actually talk about data? Nobody. They just talk about the concept, the theory. Here, what we're going to do is we're collecting all of this data, and I'll kind of give you one example of how we're going to synthesize that information, basically grower data, and give it back to you for your return on investment. This is funded through the North Central Soybean Research Program. So again, your checkoff dollars at work for farmers across the North Central. So here is kind of what's going on. This is the first cut of data, just 2 years of data going in. A couple things pop out. Number one, I think this helps with this myth that farmers are moving to wide row soybeans. That is inaccurate. 75% of farmers are still planting narrow rows, and by narrow I'm classifying that as 22 inches or less. 75% of farmers are still there. Why? Because narrow row beans still yield more. 5 to 8%. I understand why growers have moved to 30s because of logistics and more acres and fewer laborers, bigger equipment. I understand that. But yield-wise, you are still taking a penalty in that 5 to 8% on average. Okay? Next, seed treatments. Industry has been telling us for years. Let me step back a second. 15 years ago, what percentage of soybean acres had a seed treatment on it? Y'all remember? Less than 5%. Today, what number is it? Industry tells us 80%. How do we know? Well, how do we know? Data collected from farmers. This tells us, based here, across Ohio, yes, 80 to 100% of the farmers are using seed treatments across Ohio, into Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and whatnot. Next, seeding rate. What is that typical seeding rate? It's pretty interesting. You go across this part of Ohio. Average are dropping 140 to 160,000. We move to other parts, a lighter shade of green, 160 to 180. So again, what we're going to do is classify and look at what actual farmers are doing, get their yield data, and suck in all this environmental data. So let me show you a little bit more on how we're doing that. So here's an example of the higher level thinking of what we're doing. If you look here, what do you call this? Okay, state line. Okay, many of us state specialists are kind of arbitrarily bounded by these state lines and these state zones. All right? But we know things change as you move around within the state and across the state. So utilizing the weather data, all of the information we're collecting, we're building these TEDs, all right? So a TED it's not a TED Talk, if anyone is familiar with that. A TED is basically a similar yield environment where we get similar responses. So if you look at these colors here, you see these purple colors right there? Where you see that color of purple? In those environments, we tend to get the similar responses in terms of environmental conditions and input responses. So how does this play for a farmer? So here's an example, right here. So you see these different colors? See this dark green here, which would lie across parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, in Indiana. This basically tells us we are having roughly a half a bushel per acre per day yield penalty in that coloration, in that yield environment, by delaying planting. That's for yield, folks. That's what the yield penalty is. However, let's go up here to North Dakota, Yahoo. All right? What is our yield penalty for delayed planting up there? There isn't one. Doesn't damn matter when you plant up there. So the point with this is the more data we get from growers, the better information we can turn back to you for return on investment based on these TEDs or these yield environments. Then we can come up with a top 5 10-10 recommendations for your farm specifically because it lies within these TEDs or yield environments to help make decisions. And that's going to differ between you and your neighbor if they have a different TED. Does that make sense of what we're trying to do here? So again, the more data we get, the what? The better information we have to deliver back to you as farmers. All right? So again, this is my way of pushing you to get that survey from Laura, turn it around, and get us that data back so we can give you better recommendations based on our analysis. So that's my sales job on that one. All right, now, as we all know, one of the unintended consequences of earlier planting is what? Pathogen. This beautiful one here called SDS, Fusarium veligiforme. Now, one of the things we really want to do is characterize this question because up until recently, plant pathologists, and they've actually come around because they've actually started listening to agronomists for once, they've come around and initially their recommendation for SDS is to delay planting date. Okay? So what happens if a farmer delays planting date? What else are they doing? They're reducing yield. So that is not a good recommendation. So we want to characterize some of this here. So this is kind of an idea here. These are our different genetics. And again, these genetics are all gone by now because the turnover is so fast. But just to characterize the variation between planting date. So this would be early planting date, which would be early May. This would be late May and mid-June. So again, this would be disease index. Basically, how much disease do you see out there? And this disease index clearly follows what pathologists tell us. You plant early, you're going to see more symptoms. All right? They're accurate with that statement. But what do we care about symptoms? We care about yield. So let's look at yield. Remember, this channel variety right here had the highest symptomology. Guess what it also had? The highest yield. So if we look across here, it gives us a sense. We also see this variation. So we see anywhere from roughly a 10 to a 5 bushel yield difference between inoculated and uninoculated plants across these planting dates. If we specifically jump into planting dates, here's average all the varieties. Here's my inoculated, all the varieties, early planted, inoculated, which means it has SDS in those rows. Here's our yield. So again, we see a fairly linear response to delayed planting date in terms of reduction in yield. Here's our non-inoculated, which means these would be the rows paired right next to it that did not have SDS. What do you notice in this? 2 things pop out. And I know them because I made the slide. So I'm asking for, what do you guys see in this slide? Higher yield by earlier planting, regardless if you have SDS or not. 2 interesting things also points out. If you look here, if we delay planting because we think we're going to get SDS, all right, but none ever shows, we're going to get the same yield if we planted early and did what? Got SDS. So why take the risk? Because Emerson said this morning, you're not 100% certain. So again, plant early, pick a variety that's, tolerant or resistant based on the seed categories. But again, let's go back to this figure right here. See, this is our symptomology late season. Basically, planting in mid-June, we don't see any symptoms. What do we still get? Yield penalty. So you could still go through this root rot phase that they talk to by delaying planting, and even into mid-June, and we're still seeing a 5 bushel yield penalty, but you never see it because you don't see the visual symptomology. So understand there's a lot of things that play with this pathogen. So in short, plant early, use the best tolerant genetics you can, and we'll talk to Ilevo in a second in terms of a seed treatment. Any questions with this part? Yes, sir. I'm sorry. The inoculate means I inoculate it with the disease. No, that was my fault of not being clear. My wife tells me my communication is poor all the time, so I'm sure none of you other spouses have ever heard that. All right. Now, what time is it? All right. What do I got till 10:30? All right, I can do this. We can make it. All right. So I want to dig into this whole question about seed treatments a little bit. because there's a lot of things going up in the air with seed treatments. The first one, obviously, being with this neonicotinoid question. That's obviously out there that we're all aware of. This goes back, I think it's been 3 or maybe even 4 or 5 years now, where that EPA report came out that said neonicotinoids don't affect yield. Okay, I think they've had to retract that a little bit, given some of the newer yield data, but I want to address that. But also look at some of these questions related about IPM. And this is a challenge with using seed treatments, because it's, goes against our traditional IPM way of thinking. And our traditional IPM way of thinking is to do what? You go out and scout, you hit a threshold, and then you do what? You apply a treatment. Your seed treatment decision is done when in soybean seed treatments? Before you even put the seed in the ground. So the question is, how do we scout? How do we know if we're really having an effect out there? So a way to look at this is to be able to get a bigger picture and look at the variability and risk for growers, and that's how we wanted to address this. Because we know if we plant soybeans, we are going to have a susceptible host out there, right? We know the disease is out there because we've seen it before. What's the one factor that we can't predict? Environment. So then we want to look at a risk matrix to figure out how can we predict that. That's what we're going to talk about right now. So the specific one I'm going to be looking at is this fluopyram, which is Ilevo. Okay? And this is seed treatment is specifically targeted for SDS, though it does have SCN on the label. And I'm going to look at it specifically targeted toward SDS. And the questions we have, does Ilevo provide additional yield benefit and profit and economic risk benefits over your base, in this case, Poncho Votivo, or for be Cruiser Max? I'm not going to use Cruiser Max in this situation because it's stuck with the Bayer platform, but similar type of idea. Does it enhance it over your base fungicide and insecticide program? How do recent grain price declines impact your seeding rate and your seed treatment decisions? And then what is your risk as a grower for decreasing seed treatment? So just to let you know, this paper was accepted in Crop Science about 3 weeks ago. So this paper has been accepted, and this is on my website as well if you want to dig into the extension version of this and download it. All right. So these are the seed treatments we looked at. This is my current recommendation. I tell growers to drop 140,000 seeds per acre. That's my rec, okay, on most soils. If you're droughty soils, I want you to drop between 160 and 180. Droughty soils, I want 140,000 seeds out there to harvest. By droughty, I mean clay, sand, rocky, things that show drought stress. If you don't see drought stress, I want 100,000 plants out there to harvest. That's your target. Now, for most seed companies, I don't care if you err 10% higher. I say 140. If you're 150 to 160, I don't care. Roughly because you get about that much more yield gain, and what does that much more yield gain pay for? That extra seed. So it's up to you as a farmer. What do you want to do based on your equipment? But that's our recommendations. Again, I'm going to defer to Laura within the state. Here's all the gobbledygook, but these are the seed treatments we used. We used our untreated. Obviously, is our control. We had our commercial base, which would be the Evergoal Energy, plus Allegiance, Poncho Votivo. Those are the rates if anyone cares. If you're a seed treater, that way you know what rates we used. Then we added Ilevo to that commercial base, and we used the low SDS rate. So that's the lowest rate that's labeled on SDS is the rate we had on there, 0.15 milligrams AI. So you know for numbers. So we kind of broke this down into several categories, and I'll walk you through these. So we collected data from 20 environments in Wisconsin, 2 in Iowa, 1 in Indiana, 1 in Michigan, and 2 in the beautiful province of Ontario. Each one of these are our yield environments and sites. These stars are the ones where we saw visual SDS symptomology. So we actually only saw visual symptomology in a little under half of them. So again, we'll be able to characterize the use of this seed treatment both in fields that we saw visual symptoms and did not. Because remember, we still saw yield penalty without having visual symptoms. Remember that slide I showed you? If it's in the field. All right. Now, this is what Ilevo characterized, or Bayer, I should say, characterized as a halo effect. How many of you have ever heard that terminology? What is the proper terminology for that? Phytotoxicity, crop response. just a wonderful marketing, okay? Someone did a good job of saying, see, you see that? The treatment's working. Man, someone got a lot of money for that marketing thought. But the question then comes down to, is this crop response having an effect on stand? We're going to go through our plant stands. All of our Wisconsin, we'll break this down. So this line here is our gray untreated. Okay, there's our average stand over all our seeding rates. This red one right here is our commercial base, which would be the Poncho Votivo. All right? And then here is our Levo. Across all of our sites, what do you see here? What two things do you see? Seed treatments, both seed treatments did what to stand? Improved it. Okay? And then with the additional Levo, what do we see? A slight reduction. All right? So that's what we saw in terms of data. Similar, once we got into an SDS site, we didn't really see much differences, a little variation across countries, but very kind of similar type of responses. But again, what do we care about stand? What do we care about? Yield. Across all of our environments, those that both had SDS symptomology and those that didn't, again, here is our untreated, here is the addition of the commercial base, and here's the addition of a Levo. What do you see? Okay. If in the 7 sites in Wisconsin where we had the SDS pop, what do we see for a difference here? Okay. The additional Levo was better than both the commercial base and the untreated. The commercial base had no advantage over the untreated in that case in where we had SDS involved. And then these guys are just pathologists, and I never know what they're doing. Their data is all over the board. There's a reason why they're pathologists. What do they measure? Disease. What do agronomists measure? Yield. That's all I got to say. Okay. I'm not going to talk about seeding rates. Let's look at this picture. So this is our risk matrix, if you will. So this is dropping anywhere from 140,000 seeds per acre. This gray dotted line is our untreated check. The red slotted line is the commercial base. And the top red solid, I guess maroon color, if you would call it that, would be the addition of a Levo. So this would be our seeding rates by seed treatment interaction. What do you see there? Basically similar types of yield responses across. Okay, we're seeing an uptick. But let's look at risk, because growers are interested in risk. So I've showed this slide before to this group. I'll take a minute to walk you through this. So this is our economic risk table for $8 beans, and I hope none of you farmers have to only get $8 beans next year, but if you do, that's what we've set these economics against. Our base case treatment is planting 140,000 untreated seeds, okay? And we're comparing every other seed treatment by seeding rate interaction against that base case. So here, we're taking Levo seed treatment at 140,000 seeds per acre. There is an 87% probability of return on investment. That means 87% of the time you're going to break even or make money when you compare the Levo at 140 versus untreated at 140. On average, a farmer is going to make $7 an acre with that treatment. All right? Some parts of the field you're going to make 9. Do you win on every part of the field every year? No. There's risk in there. You're going to lose set 3 in some of those. What this table allows you to do is get a sense. So let's say you don't have SDS in your field. All right? So you've never found it, you've never heard of it. Let's look at the commercial base, for example. Commercial base at 120,000 seeds per acre. That's the Poncho Votivo. And we see similar stuff with Cruiser Max, so I'm not just jumping on board with Bayer here. So 120,000. What's our probability of return on investment? 93%. What's your average yield? What's your average profit per acre? $9. And there's your swing. If you look at the economic optimal seeding rate, okay, does that mean you're going to get the highest yield? No, not necessarily. Economic optimal seeding rate for both seed treatments, regardless, is 103,700 seeds. That's your economic optimal seeding rate. Probability of return on investment is between 97 and 99%. Your average profit at $8 beans is between $11 and $16. Now, am I trying to push farmers all the way down here? No, not necessarily. but it gives you an option. This could be something, as Emerson had said earlier, if you want to try something, put a couple passes out there, 100, 3,000, if you're looking at some of these seed treatments, and see how well it performs. Okay? Because how many of you have invested in equipment over the last 5 years because you didn't know what to do with all your money? Now you wish you had some of that money back. But that's just the way tax structure is. I understand. I come from a farm. I know how that works. All right? This gives you a chance to set up some of these variable rate seeding trials out there, or just some strips with these lower populations to see how they respond. Any questions on this slide? Clear as mud.
Is that drill or planter, and what's the row width?
15-inch rows using planter units. We good? Excellent. No one's looking me in the eyes, so that means they don't believe me or they want me to move on. So, all right. These are all the groups I'd like to thank as we go through it. Again, go to my website, you can find this out. Now, last 15 minutes roughly, I want to talk about this nutrient uptake and partitioning removal. Actually, if you sat through Emerson's, he did a very good job of kind of opening the floodgate on this for me. And our main objectives with this were to look at total nutrient uptake, what are these peak uptake periods, and nutrient remobilization during grain fill. All right? So again, this gives you a sense of all of our yield environments. We had plots that were up on over 100 bushels per acre and a lot of variability among sites, which is good because we're looking to try and characterize what this nutrient uptake would be. So we basically broke this into high yield fields, which would average 75 bushels per acre or more. Average is 66, and low. All right? And for the purposes here, I'm going to mainly just quickly breeze through N and P and K really quickly for you. You saw this response right here. This is total nitrogen uptake. Now, remember in Emerson's talk, he showed that meta-analysis that Salvagati gave from Nebraska. And what that did is when that came out, that brought a lot of misinformation out there. Because that meta-analysis basically said a 100 bushel soybean crop needed 500 pounds of N. That is not accurate. 100 bushel soybean crop needs 375 pounds of N. So remember when Emerson was talking about how much is mineralized and how much that can fix? There's a big difference. And what number did he show that a soybean could do? Or that field? 400. There's a big difference between 375 and 500 to see whether or not that field capacity can meet that 100 bushel response. Okay? So again, that's part of the reason why we did this, to ask that question. So this is what happens in a low yield environment. Okay? Again, a low yield environment is roughly between 40 and 60 bushels. We see after two things I like to point out. Right here, R1 soybean is right when that bean starts to flower. What percent of total N is taken up by R1? 20%. So this kind of gets to this whole timing question Emerson was talking about. There is that linear response, but we see a couple things that pop out. Number one, we're getting about roughly 30% of N uptake is happening past R5.5, which from here would probably be middle of August, I would guess, roughly. We're still taking up 30%. That old model that Salvagati was based off of and all those papers, those old models told us N uptake was done at that point. That's not accurate. Today's modern genetics, soybeans are taking up nitrogen till the day you hit it till the day it dies. Totally different. Another cool thing is the harvest index. I don't think I have the slide on here, but I'll say it. The harvest index for soybeans is 90% in high yield fields. Okay, that's the nitrogen harvest index. What does that mean? Is when you get over 100 bushels per acre, 90% of the nitrogen that that plant took up, put in the leaves, put in the petioles, goes where? Into the seed. Okay? Back when this original work was done, that number was 60%. Breeders have effectively added 30% more nitrogen harvest index. We call it an NHI. It's pretty amazing that basically plant strips as much nitrogen. I don't know how your soil recommendations are based here in Ohio. In Wisconsin, we used to get an N credit for soybeans. We don't get it anymore. Why do you think we don't get an N credit anymore? Because soybean does what? It takes it all. We no longer have an N credit in Wisconsin. We have a rotation credit, okay, but we don't have an N credit per se. Now, In an average yield environment, we're 35. In a high yield environment, 40%. 40% of that N is still taken up. And again, look at how efficient that is. It's crazy efficient. The plant, as Emerson made this context, the plant is going to take what it needs to get that yield. So it's going to strip it out of that plant. So some of the changes we've seen here, I'm not going to compare two of these, but this is based on that original Hanaway and Weber paper. The vegetative N remobilization degrade is up 13%, and we're on average up 10% after R5.5. So again, that kind of helps explain where we are in terms of that nitrogen demand and need for higher soybean yields. Uptake rate is higher and longer. Look at this. At R8 soybean, basically right before that plant dies and you hit it with a combine, that peak percent of peak rate is still 63%. That means right before that plant is dead, that plant is still taking up and remobilizing at that peak rate of 63%. Isn't that crazy? That is super crazy how efficient that soybean plant has become. These low-yielding ones, we're down to 28%. Now, removal, we've talked about this a little bit. About 3.3 pounds of N per bushel is what you deliver to the elevator, and that's just based on protein content, because that's the bigger source in there. Potassium. Potassium is one of these crazy luxury consumers. All right? It's like my brother-in-law when he comes to Thanksgiving dinner. He's a luxury consumer. He goes around and eats all he can, and then he just leaves. That's what soybean does to potassium. It'll take up as much soybean as it can, and it usually ends about R5. It's done. Then it just sits in the leaves, petioles, stems, and it's depending on yield level, dictates how much of that gets shipped off the farm in yield. Okay, if you get a crappy year, you get a drought, it's already taken it all up. It's just going to go where? Back in the residue, back in the field. All right, that's what happens with K. It's totally different than N. Here it is as an average field. Here it is in the high-yielding capacity. So again, very little is taken up late in the season. So I guess the point here is if you're looking at foliar feeding, late in the season, like in R5, does K pay to foliar feed? No, it's done. It's taken up everything that's needed. You missed your chance with K. Because this is when, roughly, do I have the map here? Here it is. Basically, it's taking it up right in that R1, R2 growth stage. That's peak uptake rate. It's right, it's a pretty narrow window where it's just going up. And what happens at R2? That's when that plant just goes from this tall to that tall. That's at peak K uptake rate. It's not a very long window. See how narrow that window is, relatively speaking, versus the other crops? And it goes off pretty quickly. There's potassium removal. So here's an example of a calculator that we just put online. And if anyone is interested, all the figures I just showed you are on my website. It's on coolbean.info. It's like a 20-page publication for everything. N, P, K, sulfur, all the micros. All of that is on my web page if interested. I'll get you there in a minute. So here's something for crop uptake and removal. So let's say I use 80 bushels per acre. And this is a calculator based on all the data we collected. It's on our Soybean Association website, which is badgerbean.com. And then you /calculator is the web page. You put in, let's say, 80 bushels is your yield potential across the field. You hit calculate, boom. What you do is it pops up total uptake, total removal in grain, and then total removal in stover. I'm not going to talk about, because I can't get it all to fit on here, we're going to talk about total uptake, total removal in grain, and we're going to focus on K2O. So an 80 bushel soybean crop, you basically remove roughly 98 pounds of fertilizer equivalent K2O you deliver to the elevator when you delivered an 80 bushel soybean crop. All right? We have a really good R squared value on there of 0.92. Very little standard error, which means it's pretty tight. Okay, because it's in the grain. You can measure that. It's pretty tight. How many of you farmers in Ohio ever bale up or remove any straw or residue, soybean residue, and bale it? Not many. We do in Wisconsin to some extent because of the dairy industry. So we put this other calculator on here in terms of stover dry matter per ton. Fertilizer equivalent of K2O, another 40. So roughly, if we have farmers in Wisconsin are basically delivering 80 bushels of fertilizer, 80 bushels of beans, and removing a dry matter stover off that field, they're basically pulling 140 pounds of fertilizer equivalent K2 off that field. every year. So what do you think the farmers have been doing the last 3 years with record yields and high fertilizer prices? Remove, 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 remove. Say that 3 times, better than me. Remove, remove, remove. There we go. And then what do you think they're doing? Add, add, add. Okay. Major point here. K is not something you want to be messing around with in terms of depleting your soils. Talk to your soils people. I'm not going to go against their recommendations. I don't know. Are you guys a soil removal? How do you guys do fertilizer reduction? Huh? You guys build up, build and maintain? You guys are build and maintain state just like we are in Wisconsin. Build and maintain. So again, the point I want to make, fertilizer K2O is relatively cheap. It is one of those inputs that is more of an investment than a cost, especially given what we've been doing with high yields. If you get 2 choices, again, this is from Wisconsin perspective. I don't know if it's similar in Ohio. The banker says you have X amount of dollars to spend on fertilizer. And you're looking at your fertilizer bill and say, should I put P out there on my soybeans or K out there in the soybeans? What should I put on my soybeans? K. Thank you. That's what you need to invest. That's where the money should go in these rates. Because again, that's one of these limiting factors you have to be cautious of. Because depleting your K levels too much causes all sorts of other problems. It builds aphids up. You have disease interactions. It's just don't do it. Okay, I know prices are tight, but that's not a place to cut. All right, with that, I got 5 minutes. Sweet, I got it done in time. Here's my website, www.coolbean.info. If you want to follow a twit, I'm at BadgerBean. It's my Twitter handle. And my blog is called thesoyreport.blogspot.com. So feel free to write these down. We do a lot of stuff with Laura Lindsay in terms of, and Shawn Castile and Emerson, a lot of the soybean group. It works pretty well together, so we have a lot of overlapping projects. So